Hey everybody, Mr. Murphy here. I'm going to talk about chapter 7.5, which is all about cell death. Just a quick reminder, we are skipping 7.4 for now. It's all about meiosis. We're going to return to that during genetics. Meiosis, of course, very similar in a lot of ways to mitosis, but because it has such a fundamentally different goal than mitosis, we don't want to confuse the two topics. I think that is a very frequent thing that happens. We get a lot of terminology that's specific to one versus the other, and that kind of muddies the waters and makes it harder to encapsulate fully, like what's mitosis in the cell cycle. That's making identical cells, and meiosis is this separate thing that happens in like one very specific place inside of most organisms and is all about genetic uniqueness and preparation for reproduction. So we want to keep those as two separate ideas. In this section, I'm going to be very brief with this just because there's really just like one important term that I want you to be familiar with and not be thrown off by if you see it. But basically, cells can die in two different ways. One is necrosis, which is basically the cell dies because of damage it's incurred or because it's starved of nutrients. Something bad has happened, and so the cell itself just ceases to function properly, and it can swell or burst or just break apart. When that happens, that can lead to all the cell insides spreading out into the extracellular matrix, which can lead to things like inflammation. That's why, like, if you get a cut on your hand, there's a lot of redness and swelling because your immune system picks up on the fact that, like, whoa, cells are dying, stuff's happening, and rushes to the scene to try to stop whatever infection or problem might be occurring. That's one way in which cells can die, and that's a pretty logical thing. You know, if you think about, like, if a person gets frostbite on their fingertips or something too, now it's starving it for oxygen or nutrients because of, you know, significant environmental condition factors. That's one way cells can die. The other way is this important term here, apoptosis. And apoptosis is it's a word that pops up sometimes on the AP exam. It's a good biology word just to be aware of. It's also really cool in that it is the programmed death of a cell. It's a way in which, through signaling processes, a cell can basically just call it and die. And that can happen for a couple different reasons. First off, maybe it's just a cell that's no longer needed. And we'll talk about this when we get to our evolution unit. But like when we were tiny little embryo babies swimming around, they're not really swimming around, just kind of sitting there. We had webbing between our fingers, right? Like, how cool would that be? You could think Aquaman or something. Or it would be really annoying. I don't know. You couldn't get a good pair of gloves probably. But the point is that the connective tissue there that existed between our fingers wasn't needed. Why was it there to begin with? That's probably a story for, like, you know, evolution, our long ago ancestors who had webbing, you know, who were wildly different organisms than us and needed it and benefited from it. And then that process of evolution and selection and things like that steered us towards getting rid of that webbing. And what's interesting about evolution, not to go too far down that rabbit hole during this unit, but what's interesting is there's not really a mechanism to go back and get rid of the genetics that caused the webbing. It's much easier and much more likely to develop another mechanism that basically just kills it off. So we create the webbing, we get rid of the webbing. We created a little tail for ourselves, and then we suck that back up too. So maybe a cell's not needed, and it's destroyed for that reason. Another reason that cells get destroyed is because old cells do unpredictable things. We just talked about the cell cycle, the control mechanism, CDKs and cyclin and all of that. Well, as cells are replicating and replicating and replicating and being exposed to chemicals and harsh environments and physical abuse, they get a little more likely to cause problems, and problems that could be things like cancer. And so our body goes through basically a rejuvenation process of many of our cell types. And you can look up statistics about, like, how often do our cells turn over, and like what part of our body is actually like still here since the beginning. And spoiler alert, it's very little of you that you actually retain from the moment you were a baby. You're mostly a new person. And you can take that to, like, you know, whatever philosophical end you want to. But The process of this is basically to get rid of those cells. So like blood cells, we're getting rid of all the time. We're making millions of blood cells like every minute of our lives. We're getting rid of old ones all the time too. Same thing with like epithelial cells, our skin, the lining of like our intestines and things like that. They go through a lot of abuse, and so those are cells that need to turn over pretty quickly. And so we don't just wait for them to necessarily like meet their natural end. Sometimes the body steps in and says like, no, you've been around for a long time. Time for you to go. Make way for the new cells that are less likely to do crazy things. So that could be days or weeks. It could be much longer for other cell types. This process, though, is a chemical process that happens basically by the lack of growth factors. So growth factors continue to push the cell forward in its division process, or separate signaling that basically triggers the death of that cell. And there's a variety of ways in which that can happen, but essentially what is occurring, or I'll give you one example that sort of explains the general process, which is the creation of a protein called perforin, which is a little protein that basically perforates the cell membrane, breaking the cell membrane apart and then allowing the insides of that cell to basically spread outwards, where they can largely be recycled. Other nearby cells can suck up those different macromolecules and make use of them. So it's not a terribly inefficient process, or not a completely inefficient process. But basically it's signaling that says something's gone wrong, or this cell has reached its end of what its intended lifetime is, and so we cut it out. And that's the process of apoptosis. There's a little more details in the textbook, but I don't want to get lost in all of that because it's not immediately relevant to us, but it is a pretty cool process. I want you to be aware of apoptosis and just the fact that cell death can be a programmed component as part of the cell life cycle. All right, if you have questions, let me know.